Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Doffney. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library. And it's my pleasure to present our speaker for today, the New Jersey State Library's Funding and Business Information Librarian, Lee Clark. Today we are going to be giving an introduction to finding grants, specifically looking at Candid's Foundation Directory Online, which is a fantastic resource for organizations who are looking for specifically foundations and other charitable organizations that give to nonprofits. But we're going to go over a lot of other things too as it comes to finding grants. So before we jump into Lee's presentation, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. We will be taking your questions today, and you can submit them at any time using the Q&A or the chat feature in the Zoom dashboard. There are 4 handouts that will be available today, and I will be uploading them to the chat once we get started. If you have trouble downloading them from the chat, don't worry, they will be available as an attachment in the follow-up email that I will be sending out as well. All attendees for today will get remote access credentials, but we cannot share them until the end of the presentation as our agreement with Candid specifies. So you do have to stay to the end of the presentation in order to get them. At the end of the webinar, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. So if you have time, we ask that you please fill out the survey. We really appreciate any and all feedback that you give us. And if you want more information on finding grants and other things related to this, Lee has curated a fantastic grant information research guide at the web address on the screen there. I will also be sending that out in the chat, so you will have a live link to that. And lastly, one last thing, I just want to do a brief overview of the Zoom dashboard. This is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, the dashboard may look a little bit different, but all of the features will still be there. In the bottom left-hand corner is your audio settings. So if you're using an external listening device, like a headset or earbuds, you can check to make sure it's connected properly there. At any point during the presentation, if you do have issues, there is a raise hand button here in the middle. You can click on that and that'll alert me. I will send you a message in Zoom and hopefully be able to resolve any problems that you are having. And then, as I mentioned, if you do have questions, use the Q&A or the chat button to get in touch with us, and we'll be happy to address them today. So that is everything that I have for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Lee now.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Let me share my screen. Okay, so you should be seeing my slides. So it says Introduction to Finding Grants. So welcome everyone. My name is Lee Clark. I am the Business and U.S. Documents Librarian. I work within the Research Library Department of the State Library of New Jersey. And we are located in downtown Trenton, right on West State Street between the State House and the State Museum. So if we are open to the public, and if you wanted to come visit us, I strongly encourage that. So before we get into today's content about finding grants and what grants are, I do want to give you a little background information about one of our collections at the State Library's Research Library, and that is the Funding Information Center. So the Funding Information Center primarily serves to assist individuals and nonprofits who are looking for grant funding and other fundraising strategies, as well as professional development materials. So we have been a subscriber to Candid's database services for quite a while. Before they even were Candid, they were originally the Foundation Center, and that merged with GuideStar a few years ago to become a new nonprofit called Candid. And through our subscription with Candid, we do provide free on-site access to 2 of their databases, the Foundation Directory Professional and GuideStar Pro. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the Foundation Directory Professional today and how you can use that to find private grant funder information. GuideStar Pro is a nonprofit directory of US-based charitable organizations. The database is derived from the IRS's business files, and then nonprofits can go into GuideStar and claim their profile and add additional content. So if you have questions about GuideStar Pro, please let me know. You can always put those in the chat, but we're not going to be covering that too much today. In addition to those research databases, we do have a print collection. We have over 1,000 items in that print collection on anything really you can think of in the social sector, nonprofit management, board governance, writing grants, um, various types of charitable organizations, research in the social sector. So if you're looking for materials for professional development, you want to learn more about a topic about nonprofit management, please check out our online catalog. Those are um, most of the items can be checked out on site if you're a New Jersey resident, or you can request them through interlibrary loan using your public library. So we do participate in interlibrary loan services. We also have free classes and tutorials, one of which you're taking advantage of right now. All of our events and uh, classes are on our website on our events calendar, which is at njstatelib.org/events. I strongly encourage you to check out that calendar. There's classes and webinars on all different types of topics, not just nonprofit management, history, genealogy, health. Andrew has done a great job of curating some wonderful classes. We do have one coming up on April 1st, our introduction to proposal writing class. So that is on the calendar if you wanted to sign up for that. That is a very basic introductory class on things that you may need to consider when you're applying for a grant, specifically for a project proposal. So if you're interested in that, please sign up. That is virtual and it is free. So we are not the only library in the state of New Jersey that offers that free access to GuideStar Pro and the Foundation Directory Professional. So there are other libraries throughout the state that have similar subscriptions than that the state library's research library does. So I've listed a few that are in New Jersey. There are other ones throughout the country as well. Definitely take a look at your local library, see what they have to offer. There's a website at the bottom of the screen. That is where you can put in your zip code and see what library is closest to you. There might be a library if you're close to Pennsylvania or New York. There might be a library in a different state that's actually closer. And these locations change from time to time, so definitely look at the website of that library, give them a call ahead of time, and see what they have to offer. Is there a staff person there to help you? Can you use your library? Do you have to use the library's computers, or can you bring your laptop? At the state library, how we have the databases authentication set up, you do have to use our public library computers. You can't use your laptop. It's a different IP address, but other libraries are set up differently. So it really just varies from library to library, who's available to help you and how that access is. But the way the subscription works, it is on-site access only. So you do have to come on site to use those services. At the end of today's webinar, you will get a temporary login credential for the database that we're going to talk about, the Foundation Directory Professional. That'll give you 48 hours to practice what we talk about today. But then after that, you do have to come on site or subscribe in some other way to use that database. So before we get into the content today, I do want to see where we're coming from. What is our experience level? So if Andrew can launch our first poll, that asks you, how would you describe your experience with finding and applying for grants? Are you brand new to it? Um, oh, we're going to launch that poll one more time because that was the wrong one. Yep, there we go. So how would you describe your experience with finding and applying for grants? Are you brand new? Have you dabbled or supported others? Have you written and submitted grants already? And lastly, are you a lead or a manager in the grant seeking efforts of your organization? So while we're answering that poll, I just want to give you some background about what we're going to talk about today. We are going to primarily focus on private grant funding today, funding that's coming from private foundations and those foundation grants. But if you are interested in governmental grants, we will show you some resources where you can find more information about that. It is slightly different in that applying some of the topics, though, some of the strategies that we're going to talk about do apply to um, governmental grants as well. So I'm going to give everybody else a moment to finish that poll, and then we'll see what our results are. Okay, so it looks like most of us are either brand new or have dabbled a little bit in it. That's about like 69% of our attendees today. We do have at least one person that manages grant efforts, and we do have a few people that have applied for grants already. So hopefully you get some helpful tips out of here. And if you're brand new, this is perfect. This is an introductory class. So thank you for that feedback. So after today's webinar, hopefully you'll be more comfortable with identifying the different types of grants that are out there and who's giving them. You'll be able to determine if your organization is grant ready, if you're able to have that infrastructure to apply for grants and to execute grant um, programs. You'll know how to evaluate potential funders using the tools that we'll talk about. And you'll be able to understand that initial approach that you can plan for each funder. Every funder is different, and how you approach them is going to depend on the funder themselves. They'll have different staff structure and administration for how they go about doing that initial approach for a funder. So grants and other funding sources. So it's important before we get into actually trying to find those grants to understand that grants are just one aspect of fundraising within your organization. Now, I'm going to talk mostly in terms of users that are nonprofits because the types of grants that we're going to talk about today, those private grant funding from private foundations, are mostly applicable to nonprofits. If you're coming from a different type of organization, just keep that in mind. Um, so remember, you cannot sustain your organization. It's very unlikely that you can sustain your organization on grants alone. You're going to need multiple revenue streams, and funders do look for that. They're looking for financially strong organizations to invest in so that they know that when they make that investment, it's going to actually pay off. So to kind of emphasize this, we have our second poll, and I want you to think about what do you think the largest source of private contributions to nonprofits is? This does not include government funding or other types of funding strategies. This is primarily private donations. So is it going to be bequests? Is it going to be direct donations from corporations? Is it going to be funding from foundations, whether that's in the form of grants or some other types of funding vehicle? Or is it direct donations to or from individuals? So what do you think represents the biggest piece of the pie in terms of funding going to nonprofits? And we're going to look at some data from a report that comes out every year to see which of these options is correct. And again, this does not include government funding, whether that's through grants or contracts. It doesn't include fees for service. That's a big revenue stream for a lot of nonprofits that are charging fees for the services that they provide. All right, so we have our answers. So most people are thinking that foundations represent the biggest chunk of the pie. Then we have tie of individuals and corporations, and then coming in last is bequests. So this is interesting. Let's look at the data. So this is based on last year's report, the 2025 Giving USA report that's issued every year by the Giving Institute. And if you notice, individuals represent 66% of the total contributions coming from nonprofits as reported in this report. So that's individual donations. So it's different than what we thought. Grants and foundation funding does represent a pretty good chunk at almost 20%, 19% there. Why do you think individuals represent such a large piece of the pie? And feel free to share your comments in the chat. If you have any ideas why that pie is, or that sector of the pie graph is so much larger for individuals, feel free to put that in the chat. I'm kind of interested to see what your thoughts are. One thing that I can tell you is that for individual donations, there's a lot less administration that goes involved. Sometimes it's a simple ask. You put out an ask for individual donations and they give directly to you. With foundation grants, there's usually a lot more administration. You have to go through the application process, there's an evaluation, and then they have to approve that application. And if you do get the funding, there's usually a lot of reporting that is involved. So there is that added administration with foundation grants. We have some comments. There's a passion for the mission. Individuals definitely are more connected emotionally, usually, to what they give to, whatever that is. And that passion and that emotion um, can be advertised to donors to kind of play on their heartstrings to get them to donate to make them understand that they are going to have an impact in the community if they donate to your organization. Also, there are a lot more people in the world than there are foundations. So, and these are not necessarily wealthy people. They could just be everyday people that want to give to the organizations that they are they feel passionate about. And that is a couple of the comments that we had in the chat is that personal connection with an organization. That is definitely a very strong reason that people give. So just keep that in mind that you should be pulling from multiple revenue streams, including individual donors and other types of streams, and that grants are generally more of a long-term fundraising strategy for your organization. And that's the next thing that we're going to talk about is just to kind of set your expectations that getting a grant is labor and time intensive. Not only do you need to give yourself enough time to apply for the grant, but you also need to give yourself enough time to get the money if you are awarded that funding. And then, of course, to execute the grant program. I'm going to grab a sip of water. So you want to think long term when you're trying to plan for applying for grants and when you're looking for grants. I have had people come into the library and they're like, we need money within the next few months for X, Y, and Z. Generally, grants are not going to be your option there because it does take some time for that funding to come in, even after you've applied for it. And you may not be able to apply for that grant right away. Grants open up usually once or twice a year, maybe sometimes more than that, and you have a short window to apply. So there's no hard and fast numbers out there. It varies from funder to funder, but generally you could be waiting 6 to 9 months between when you have applied for the funding to when that funding actually becomes available for your organization to use. That's not unheard of. And you need to understand that you want to apply to more grants than you actually need because generally you may get 1 in 3 grants that you apply for, and that's a good rate of return. It's usually harder when you're starting out, when you haven't gotten that initial grant first. So your success rate might be lower than that. And those success rates, I've had questions about what's the average success rate for a grant. It's hard to say because sometimes funders don't put that information out. So I don't want to be negative, Nancy, here. I don't want to dissuade you from applying for grants because people do get grants. And if you have gotten grants out there, feel free to put like a thumbs up as an emotion on the Zoom call because there is money out there for you to get. You just need to prepare yourself and to what to expect and to think long term. Because if you get that grant, it could be the start of a very beneficial relationship between you and the funder. And that could lead to more funding down the road and less restrictive funding down the road if you build and nurture that relationship. So we're going to talk a lot about research today, but that relationship component of not only grant funding, but all fundraising is really essential. Sometimes funders can be very hands-on. They might give you advice. They might provide technical assistance. They might even refer you to other funders. So the more you can nurture that relationship, or even if it's a potential funder that maybe isn't the greatest fit, they might suggest another organization that you can reach out to. Funders are people too. There's people behind those organizations and they talk to each other. So making sure you're building strong relationships and you're putting your organization out there as a potential grantee that's a good investment is really, really important. Okay, so we're going to talk about the different types of organizations that give grants. I did see that there was a question in the chat, so I just want to look at that real quick. So what is the typical size of a grant versus individual contribution? So that varies widely. It depends on the sector, it depends on the individual, and individuals might give a little money. There might be Larger donors, it varies. There is some data out there if you wanted to look. Giving the Giving Institute is great. Um, we have the Center for Nonprofits in New Jersey that puts out their trends report, so you can kind of track like what sector is giving the most amount of money. Um, but that is a hard question to answer specifically, because it's very general. So who gives grants? So the first thing I want to talk to you about today, we're going to be focusing on foundation grants, private funding coming from private foundations. So private foundations are 501(c)(3) nonprofits, very similar to probably many of you. They are regulated by the IRS, and they're actually probably more highly regulated by the IRS than other nonprofits because they are deriving their revenue from one source. They exist to primarily give funding or support charitable purposes through that funding, through that grant making. And they are required by the IRS to give at least 5% of their assets out each year. So they have to give that money away. Some funders might give more, but they have to at least give that 5% away. A lot of times they'll give that 5% and then they'll reinvest their other assets to perpetuate their giving from year to year. And to monitor private foundations, the IRS requires them to submit the 990 PF tax form. So you might be familiar with 990 tax forms if you are coming from a nonprofit. Nonprofits have to give those to the IRS every year, just like a person would do their taxes. But the 990 PF is a little bit more specific to private foundations, and in there you can find a wealth of information on the grants that private foundations give, who they gave them to, how much they gave, generally what they gave them for. Sometimes that's not very specific. You can find a list of their board members, information about who to contact if they do accept applications for grants, whether or not they accept applications for grants. And these tax forms are freely available online. So I will talk a little bit more about that in the future. The main type of private foundation that you might see is the independent foundation. That's where that revenue is being derived from one source. It could be an individual, it could be a family, it could be a corporation. We'll talk about corporate foundations in just a moment. And they give for a wide variety of philanthropic purposes. So it really depends on usually what the initial donor's interests were. But if that foundation has been in existence for a long time, those funding priorities do tend to change over time. So you want to keep in mind, and while you're researching, to look at relatively recent data. So these on the screen are some foundations that exist and operate and give in New Jersey. Just a very, very small sample. Some are very large, like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Some are smaller, like the Mary Ellen Borden Foundation. Mary Ellen Borden Foundation has a website. Some foundations are so small, they don't have staff, they don't have websites. So sometimes it can be a little tricky to find information on them. You may have to reach out if you can find someone to contact. There are funders that only give to pre-selected grantees. They've indicated that on their 990 tax form. But if that indication is there, don't let that dissuade you. Sometimes if they're doing similar work to you, you might be able to get on their radar to form that connection and be invited to become a grantee. Again, that's part of the relationship building. So corporate foundations are a type of independent foundation where the money is derived from a for-profit corporation. However, they are their own nonprofit entity. So they have their own board. They are governed by the rules of a private foundation, and they are monitored by the IRS. They have to submit those 990 tax forms. Some examples that operate here in New Jersey are on the screen. TD Charitable is a big one, PSE&G. A lot of banks have corporate foundations, a lot of utility companies. So look in your community where you serve and see what corporations exist there, because corporate foundations want to have visibility. They want to show that they're giving back to the community. It's really a good look for them. So they're really more about branding than some other foundations tend to be. And usually the focus of their giving does connect back either to the owner of the company or what the company does. And usually it's very easy to find a lot of information about them. So the next type of organization is not a private foundation. This is a public charity. It's a nonprofit. But there are public charities that give grants. They tend to fall into some type of few types of pools. The community foundation is one, and that is when they're issuing funding to support a specific geography. If you're not familiar with your area community foundation, I strongly encourage you to look into them, see what they do, see if there's anything that they can do to help you connect with the nonprofits in your area, to connect to funders. Oftentimes, private uh, community foundations will have donor advised funds, and I will talk about those in a moment. They're slightly different than the more commercial ones that you might hear about through like Fidelity or Schwab that I'll talk to you about in a little bit. But definitely take a look at your community foundation and see what their focus is on and if they issue any funding. Some other types of grant-making public charities focus on specific issues or populations. So the New Jersey Council for Humanities is a public charity that issues grant funding for the humanities in New Jersey. ALA, while they are supporting libraries throughout the country, they also do issue some grants. The United Way Network is a public charity that issues funding. So there are many different varieties of public charities and the ways they give. So definitely do not discredit those as well. Take advantage of all the different funders out there. And then the last two types of funders that I want to talk to you about today are corporate giving programs that come directly from the company. So this is giving coming directly from the company in the form of cash funding or in-kind support. Um, Giving doesn't necessarily have to come in the form of money. It could come in the form of service or goods. So think about that in terms of what you need within your organization. Sometimes there's an employee matching gift program that might come directly from the corporation or is funneled through the foundation. But the corporate giving programs are coming directly from the corporation, which is a little bit different than the corporate foundation. Corporate foundations are separate. They have their own reporting requirements based on the IRS's requirements. So it's a little bit easier to find information for the corporate foundation than it is for the corporate giving programs. They don't have the same reporting requirements because it's coming directly from the company. So just keep that in mind. Just because you can't find data doesn't necessarily mean they're not giving money. A great place to find information about direct corporate giving is in press releases, media posts. Usually companies want to advertise if they are supporting their community. And then lastly, we have donor advised funds, also known as DAFs. Donor advised funds are increasingly becoming a vehicle for people to give through, especially with more financial institutions like Fidelity or Schwab or Vanguard providing these funds that individuals can invest their money into. These are technically private foundations where people will put their money and then advise, let's say, Fidelity to give to a certain nonprofit. So while they are technically private foundations, you're not going to approach Fidelity Charitable for a grant. But if you know somebody within your network that has a DAF account, you can advise them to give through it to your organization. Think of it more as a donation from an individual as opposed to a donation from a foundation. There is a lot of information out there about DAFs. If you have more questions, I can direct you to that information. I'm not an expert in this at all. So I just want you to be aware of it because sometimes those DAF private foundations do creep up in the foundation directory professional just because they are technically private foundations and they have a lot of money as assets. I'll point that out if I can remember in our demo. Okay, so I'm going to talk about one more thing and then I'm going to see if we have any questions. If at any time you have any questions, feel free to put that in the chat. So some types of grants, and we're going to talk very generally. There's a lot of different words that can describe grants out there. But in very general terms, we're going to look at it in two kind of buckets, restricted grants and unrestricted grants. Restricted grants are for a specific purpose. So it could be a program, it could be construction, it could be for some research purpose, but they are going towards a very specific focus, and there are guidelines around what you can spend your money for. To start off with, you're generally going to probably get these more often than not. But there are funders that do give unrestricted funding as well. Unrestricted grants, sometimes known as general operating support, can go to anything that you need within your organization, whether that's rent, keeping the utilities on, purchasing equipment, going towards salary. You can have some of those overhead costs incorporated into restricted grants, depending on the guidelines of the funder, but it's usually limited to the scope of whatever you're trying to fund within that restricted grant. Usually, these unrestricted grants may come later as you develop more of a relationship with the funder. But again, every funder is different in what they provide. It's a little bit easier for a funder to measure if a grant program is successful with these restricted grants because it is much more fixed. Um, But if you are looking for that unrestricted grants, and a lot of nonprofits are, because we all need to keep the lights on, uh, it's a potentially with that relationship building, you can get that down the road. You may also see the term request for proposal. Not every private funder needs to issue a request for proposal or a grant announcement, but if they do have a specific program that they're looking for applicants for, this happens a lot with corporate foundations or larger private foundations. They may have specific programs that they support and that they want grant applicants for. They might issue this request for proposal. This is a very small chunk of the grants that are issued. For the private funder, this is very different than a government grant. Government grants have to issue those notices of funding opportunities. They're required. Private funders are not required. So keep that in mind. If you're just looking for at the RFPs, you're missing out on a vast majority of those private grants. There are some free resources for requests for proposals. So I will point those out in our research guide later on. So I'm going to stop there before we talk about are you grant ready to see if we have any more questions and to get a sip of water. Andrew, do we have any questions in the chat that I missed?
Yes, one person asked if you could repeat the two statistical resources you provided earlier. They heard the Giving Institute, but couldn't remember the other one.
The Center for Nonprofits has a Trends and Outlook report that they issue every year. I think the new one is actually coming out at the beginning of March. I think they have a webinar coming up. So if you're interested in seeing what happens in the social sector in New Jersey, definitely attend that webinar. The Center for Nonprofits website is also a great resource in general. So they have some data there. And that's just two. There are other data collectors out there as well. And we have a nonprofit management research guide that I can point to that has some of those sources. So next we're going to talk about, are you grant ready? So before you go into the planning process, or the research process, you have to do some planning internally within your organization because grant research, grant application is time intensive and it requires resources. So you want to make sure you have buy-in from your organization's leadership, that you have the infrastructure and capacity within your organization to apply for the grant and to execute it, and that you give yourself enough time. So we're going to be talking a lot about private foundation grants today, and private foundations are required to give to legal nonprofits, and that's usually determined through a 501c3 determination letter from the IRS. So if you are not a nonprofit with that 501c3, don't let that discourage you. There are grants out there, but the majority of the private foundations are going to be issuing those grants to legal nonprofits, and they will ask you for that determination letter. If you are thinking about starting a nonprofit, the Center for Nonprofits has a very detailed guide on their website that talks through the benefits of starting a nonprofit, what's required in New Jersey, and what's required federally. I strongly encourage you to take a look at that before you actually apply, and do your research because there are alternatives as well. And then do you have the bandwidth within your organization to seek a grant? Have you given yourself enough time? Do you need the money right away? If so, perhaps applying for a grant is not the best option. You're going to rely on those other fundraising strategies. Have you thought long term about your fundraising within your organization, what you're going to need next year or the following year? Do you have the support, the staff support, the financial infrastructure within your organization to execute the grant if you do get that? Funders will definitely look at your track record of success. So making sure you have the documentation within your organization to show them that you have done similar work, that you have done things that you can show that you are a credible nonprofit, that you can actually execute what you're saying you can execute within your grant application. Part of demonstrating your credibility to funders is also showing that you run well. Do you have strong leadership? Are your boards invested in your organization? Do you have financial controls? Can you provide a budget? Can you show that that budget is balanced, that it has a strong financial base, that if you didn't get this grant, that you would still be moving forward with your organization and with your project or program that you're trying to support through other fundraising streams? And that can be challenging, especially if you're a newer nonprofit, to show that track record. So that's where you might have to fall back on some of the other fundraising strategies available to nonprofits and organizations. Now, there are funders that will support newer nonprofits. There are grants out there, but just keep in mind that generally funders are looking for that track record. And sometimes they will specifically say that they have to be in operation for 3 years, 5 years, whatever the funder requires. And then are you ready to be transparent? Because you are going to have to provide all this information to the funder. So making sure you have your documentation in place before you go into the research and especially application process is going to make your life so much easier. So talk within your organization, make sure you have this documentation in place before you go to apply for grants. And then the bread and butter of today's webinar is finding prospects, finding grant prospects. So when you research, you want to think, who should I ask? Who's doing similar work? Who's supporting similar subject areas, geographies to my organization? How much should you ask for? Before you go into the research process, you should have a number in mind. How much money do you need for X, Y, and Z within your organization? If you're looking for general operating support, try to break that up into buckets. You need funding for this, you need funding for that. That's going to generally operate your organization. Think of it in pieces. If you do have a specific program that you're trying to support, understand the cost that you're going to need to ask for, because there are funders that can meet that capacity, and then there are funders that might not be able to meet that capacity, that might not be able to give to the level that you're looking for. And you might have to piece together funding from different funders. And then you want to think, how should you approach them? That's the initial approach. Every funder is going to be different in their initial approach. And that's part of the research, is trying to figure out how you're going to make that initial contact with the funder once you've identified them. So I'm a big proponent of research as a librarian. You want to do your homework. You want to make sure you know who you're approaching and why you're approaching them. You're not just randomly applying for this grant because you saw it, because that's generally going to be a waste of your time and the funder's time. Usually funders, very often I hear um, that the most common reason is that they didn't get the grant is because it wasn't a good fit. They didn't support what they were asking for. They didn't read the eligibility requirements. That's a big red flag. Uh, I'm always floored when I'm listening to funder panels, just how often people get disqualified because they didn't follow instructions. So make sure you're reading all of the funder's documentations very, very carefully, and that you meet the eligibility requirements and that it is a good fit, that the funder is supporting the work that your organization does and once funded. So try to find out as much as you can about the funder. We're going to talk about different sources of where you can find that information in a moment, and be prepared to explain why you're approaching them, how your mission aligns with theirs. Show that you've done your research. So our final poll for today is, how have you searched for grants in the past? I just want to kind of see where we're coming from. What have we used in the past? So Andrew's going to launch this last poll. Okay, it's up now. So feel free to choose anything that applies. You can choose multiple options. So if you've never searched for grants before, you can choose that first option. Have you applied for grants based on suggestions or gotten suggestions from people in your network? Used a very strategic search within a search engine like Google, Bing, looked at 990 tax forms, which we've talked about already, used grant or funder databases like the Foundation Directory or Grant Station, looked at newsletters or email alerts, looked at social media or something else. If there's another source that's not listed there, feel free to put that in the chat if you want to share it with everyone. And I do apologize, I'm coming off a cold, so if my voice gets a little froggy, I do apologize about that. All right, so Andrew has closed that poll. Let's see where we're getting our sources from. Okay, so it's kind of all over the map. A lot of people are using search engines, which a lot more and more funders are having a website presence, but there are still a lot of, especially smaller private foundations that don't have websites. So just be aware of that. A lot of people are getting suggestions from their network. That's great to hear. That is a big source. The more you talk to people within your network, within the nonprofits that are doing work, talking to your board, knowing if your board has connections with funders, that can be a really great resource. We have a few people that have never researched before. One person that does use 990 tax forms. They're not always the most fun to look at, but that information is in there if you're willing to look for it. And then we have some others using those other sources. Let's see if anybody put anything in the chat. Funding lists from like organizations. Oh, that's a good resource. Thank you, Andrea. So yeah, so you can use databases like the Foundation Directory Professional. We're going to look at that today. There are other database tools out there. I mentioned GrantStation. GrantStation's a little different than the Foundation Directory because it's focused on grant announcements, which again, not every funder has to issue those grant announcements. So if you're only looking at those, you're missing out. So you want to look at multiple sources to kind of cover all your bases in terms of finding every grant opportunity possible, hopefully. If the funder does have a website, definitely look at their website. That's going to have the most up-to-date information. But again, not every funder does have a website. Um, Social media can be great, especially if you're trying to network, see what they're doing. That's going to have a lot of up-to-date information. But again, not every funder has that social media presence. If you are looking for governmental grants, I'm going to put a plug out there for government grants. Follow the funding agencies. They're usually pretty good about posting things. Um, and some other funders are very good about posting things as well. This is also a great place to see if they funded organizations similar to yours, to see what they funded in the past and get more details than just, oh, they funded the arts. No, they funded this specific arts organization for this specific performance. You'll get more details that way. And then I'm glad to see most people are using their networks because that is an excellent source. Sometimes if you talk to a funder and they know that they're not the right fit, they might actually recommend you talk to another funder. Um, just remember, there are people behind the foundation's name that are trying to do good work, just like your organization. And they do talk to each other and they do network with each other. And you should be out there networking as well. If you if you haven't looked in your area, definitely look out and see if there's any nonprofit networking meetings, if there are nonprofits support groups. I attend the Trenton area stakeholders meeting here in Trenton every once in a while, and that's always a great place to see the nonprofits that are doing work in the Trenton area. And that is also a great place to get ideas about funding as well. So definitely reach out to the networks in your community and in your subject area. I do want to pop out of my slides and show you our grant information research guide. I did mention this a couple times. This has a ton of resources on it, not only on private grants, but state and federal grants as well. So I'm going to switch my share. So I did have before I switch my share, there is a comment from James. Vast majority of libraries are not 501(c)(3) nonprofits. Yes, generally there's a lot of libraries that are considered local government entities. So that is where applying for private grant funding can be a little tricky. And there's a couple different, there are other strategies for for public libraries to apply. Sometimes they are considered for them. But if you have a specific question, I strongly encourage you to look for information based on the type of entity that you are. Um, and also, some libraries do have friends groups, they do have foundations that work to apply for funding as well. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about that, but there is some, if you want more information specific for libraries, feel free to send me an email. And we do have a specific tab. I'm actually going to open this research guide up and switch my share because we do have a specific tab for libraries. So let me switch my share so you can see that. Okay, so you should be seeing our grant information research guide. That is linked in your slides. It's also available on our website. And if you go to our website, njstatelib.org/funding info, that will bring you to our Funding Information Center page. It's linked in the handouts that you're going to get. Has a link to the database, which will not work unless you have the login credentials or you're on site. But it also has links to our research guides and some tutorial videos if you're interested. The Grant Information Research Guide is what I'm going to show you now, but that Nonprofit Management Research Guide that I mentioned is also linked here. So the Grant Information Research Guide does have a tab specifically for libraries because we are the state library. We do get a lot of questions from public libraries about funding. But there's also information on federal grants. Points a lot to grants.gov. That is a kind of the one stop place to search for federal grant funding. The state does not have a similar kind of one place portal to look for grants. It is based on the individual agencies. So I do link to the agencies. The New Jersey Department of Treasury's Grant Management Office has some wonderful resources on how to search for federal and state grants. They do have monthly programs, monthly webinars that they've been doing for the last few months that are really, really very interesting. If you're looking for more details about the grant process, I definitely encourage you to check them out. And then for private grants, there's a lot of good information here, information about different grant maker databases, including the Foundation Directory. Recently, the Center for Nonprofits, as well in partnership with the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers, partnered with Impala to execute a philanthropy hub for New Jersey nonprofits. And if you are coming from a nonprofit, you can use that for free through October 2028. So if you're interested in that, definitely take a look at that. It uses similar data that the Foundation Directory does, but it's kind of organized in a different way. Then if you're interested in learning more about 990 tax forms and how to use them, where to find them, you can find them for free online through various different portals. I personally like the ProPublica site. You don't have to log in to access it. It's very user-friendly. And then at the bottom, there's some guides on where to find the specific information because it is a tax form. So sometimes getting to what you're looking for can be a little tedious. So where to find the specific sections that have the information that you need. So that is our research guide. Definitely strongly encourage you to check that out. Let me go back to my slides. Okay. The next thing we're going to look at is the Foundation Directory database. We're going to do a very brief tutorial. So I'm going to check the time. Very brief tutorial on how to initially search in that. And then you will get those credentials at the end of today's webinar where you can practice what we're talking about and try searching for your organization. So the Foundation Directory Professional is a database that is full of past giving data. A lot of that data is coming from those 990 tax forms. It's a little bit different than like a grant station, which has active grant announcements. The data that we're going to see in Foundation Directory is past giving data. So just keep that in mind. And this is primarily private foundations and grant-making public charities. It does have some federal funding information in it, but it's very high level. It's not super useful. If you're looking for federal data, there are other sources that you can use that are a little bit better. And I can more than willing to answer any questions you have on that. So let's get into the database. Let me show you that. So I'm going to switch back to my website screen. I'm going to go to our Funding Information Center website, and I'm going to actually just click this link. The link that you're going to get with the credentials is provided. It's the same link. So I previously signed in, but when you get it, you're going to have to sign in at the top here. This is a little bit different than what it would look like if you are coming on site, just because I'm signed in with my personal contact information, as opposed to just going on site and using the IP address of our library. So there's going to be this banner at the top. Recently, Candid has pushed out their Candid Search, which actually combines data from the Foundation Directory and GuideStar Pro into one platform. For today's purposes, I'm just going to ignore that because our database subscription hasn't changed. So I feel just ignore that. You can click that X. And right here, you're going to see that simple search box. I'm going to exclude federal funding because I'm not interested in that today. And I'm going to type in what I'm trying to fund and where that funding is going to be used. Okay, so let's say I'm trying to fund senior housing services in Camden County, New Jersey. So I'm going to type in senior housing services, Camden County, New Jersey, and I'm going to hit search. So it's going to take that everyday language that we've typed in. Again, you want to put in what you're trying to fund and where the funding is going to be used. That subject area and geographic focus is important. And what this database does is it tries its best to match what we've typed to terms used in the database to code these grants. So I have retirement housing, New Jersey, Camden County, and seniors here at the top. Those are the terms that it matched to. Sometimes these are going to be accurate. Sometimes you're going to have to tweak it a little bit. Most often than not, you're going to have to edit it a little bit. And you can do that through this edit option or by going into the advanced search and filters. So I'm going to take a look at these advanced search and filters. I have my subject area, that's my what. My subject area is what I'm trying to fund, what I'm trying to support. I have my where the funding is actually going to be applied, not where you're located, not where the funder is located, but where is the funding actually going to be used? Where are the communities that you're supporting? I'm going to take out New Jersey because I just want to see funding that was given in Camden County specifically. And I do have a population that I'm serving, so I can put that in here. You don't have to put in a population served if you're just serving the general public. But if you are serving a specific population, feel free to put one in. You can click in and see the hierarchy of search terms. If you wanted to browse, you can also start typing and it'll bring up terms using those words. That's true for the population served. It's also true for the subject area. There's some additional filters here. Support strategy and transaction type can sometimes be useful. I tend to leave those blank though initially. The support strategy is what the funding is actually going to be spent on. So say you're doing a capital expense, say a building purchase or renovation, you can select that in here. There's a lot of different options. And then the transaction type is actually the type of grant that you're looking for. In most cases, it's going to be a cash grant, but there are other options used in this database. I'm going to leave that blank though. And then I am going to close that up. And actually, I think I want to broaden my subject area a little bit here. Retirement housing is a little bit too specific for what I'm looking for. So I'm going to click this X, and then I'm going to go in here and just retype retirement. So as I type retirement, this retirement housing comes up, and I can see the broader term is elder housing. So that's actually what I'm going to choose to broaden my search. And you can do that for geographic focus. You can also do that for population search. So if you're finding you're not getting a lot of results, you could always broaden those terms. So I'm going to hit search, see what I get. So I'm not getting a whole lot of results. Elder housing is still pretty specific subject area. So what I'm going to do, if I want to get more search results, I'm actually going to broaden this to all of New Jersey. So I increased my geographic focus and I have a lot more results. So what this database does is it shows you results in 4 categories. You have your grant makers who have given grants in the area that we've searched. These are past grants that were given, the grants that they gave, the recipients of those grants, and then the 990 tax forms where those grants were reported. Again, you can get those 990 tax forms outside of the database. So I'm going to stop there. If you have any questions about searching in Foundation Directory, feel free to put those into the chat. Um, Most people come into this database, they're looking for that grant maker information. So that's what we're going to focus on today. But you can also look based on recipients. So if you know there's very similar organizations that are getting funding, you can see who is funding them and get ideas about funders that way. If you go into the view all, you'll see a full list of the grant makers, and there's some additional filters at the top. This exclude grant makers not accepting applications is a common question that I get. On the 990 tax form, there is a box that funders can check to say they only give to pre-selected grantees. And if you were to check this box, that's going to exclude the people that have marked that they only give to pre-selected grantees. Now, if I click this, there's going to be a warning because sometimes while a funder will say they only give to pre-selected grantees, it doesn't necessarily mean that will exclude you from funding forever. If you're doing similar work, if you're building a relationship with that funder, you may eventually be invited to apply for funding through them or to get grants from them. Again, every funder is different. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will issue grants. And also, if you notice, we had 500 and some grants before I checked that box. Now we only have 140. So there's a lot of funders that were excluded by checking that box. Within the grant maker results list, the grant count and the amount funded is in the area that we search. That's multiple years of giving. The total assets and total giving represent the last year's reported total assets and total giving. So this is 1 year, this is multiple years of giving. And this is only in the area that we searched. By default, it will organize by the number of grants given in the area that we searched. Sometimes that's not the most accurate or the most appropriate way to search. So you can refilter by clicking the headers as well. So if you want to see who's given the most amount as opposed to the most number of grants. Okay. I don't see any other questions. I'm going to go into a profile and show you what that looks like. And then we'll go back to our slides today. So you can, in this window, you can download a list of funders. If you check the ones that you're interested in, you can check up to 100 at a time. You can download either a PDF list just of what's visible here or a spreadsheet. I prefer that, way prefer that because you have additional contact information if you choose that spreadsheet option. You can also save it, combine different things. There's a lot more flexibility with the spreadsheet option. This little envelope just allows you to email directly the PDF options. You cannot email directly the CSV. So I do encourage people, if you're coming to the library, to bring a flash drive, some type of storage device to save things to. Okay, so let me go into a profile and show you what that looks like. So every funder, every grant maker is going to have a profile. If they have a website, it's going to be at the top. It's going to show you when this profile was last updated. Profile was last updated. You're going to see a 5-year snapshot of their total giving right here at the top. So you can see, is what I'm trying to do a priority for this funder? Yeah, they've supported it, but is it like their main thing that they support? Is it a priority? Human services is their top funding subject. They fund heavily in New Jersey. That's a good indication that they probably fund what I'm looking for. I will have to do a little bit more digging though. And then when you're doing your research, you should have a number in mind so you can match what the funder gives to what you need as an organization. So this most common grant amount is from 10,000 to 25,000. So if that's kind of where my ask is going to be, that's a good sign. But then you also want to look, what's the most common grant amount given in the area that I searched? This is $1,000. So that's a little bit different than this. So maybe I'm either focusing too closely in the area that I searched. So let me see what they've given overall. So this right here is just the grants in the area that I searched for elder housing for seniors. If I click this little X, I can see what they've given overall. So this does not have a ton of updated information for this funder. There's a little bit more of a gap than I would expect. There's usually a 2-year gap. So if you're seeing like 2023, 2024 data for a funder, that's not uncommon. This gap is a little bit wider than I would have expected, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're not still giving in the area that I searched. And you can see who they gave to, when they gave, how much they gave. And if you want to revert back to the filters that we had before, you could just click that little circle. The first section that I do like to look at is the application and RFP section. That's going to give information about applying for grants if it's available. This funder has a website, so that's probably where this information is coming from. You always want to check the website because that's going to have the most up-to-date information. It's also going to give giving limitations. So if there is a restriction on what they give, where they give to, if it's only for a specific county, or say they don't give to religious organizations, it will say that generally in this section. Of course, read through the funder's documentation and look at the eligibility. Here you can also see the initial approach. So their initial approach is a letter of inquiry, sometimes known as an LOI. And that's going to let the funder screen to see if it's appropriate for them to fully apply for funding. It also talks about different things that they should submit. That IRS determination letter is going to show that they are a legal nonprofit. So if I go back up to the top, funding interest, this is just some codes used, words used to code the grants in the database. The About section will give you information about their mission, when they were established, if they have specific programs that they support. Sometimes that'll appear here. The Financial section is where you can get a link to their 990 tax form. So they do have more recent 990 tax forms. Sometimes the problems with the 990 tax forms is that the grant information is in an attachment, and then when that attachment is uploaded, or when that 990 is uploaded, that attachment isn't there. So sometimes that data is missing, and I've run into that fairly often. You can request that information from a funder. It should be made available. In the Who's Who section, you can find links to their board members if they have key staff. This is a great list to show your board to see if you do have a connection with the funder or anybody in your network, to see if you can build that connection. The news section is where anything that candidates found that they appear in the news. A lot of times it's social media. It might be an article about who they supported. This is a great way to find those details about who they are actually funding, just to make it crystal clear that you're a good match with this organization. At the bottom, you can see what type of foundation they are, what type of organization. You get their EIN number, which I always like to note because this is a great way to find them later on. Some organizations, they have a legal name and then they go by a different name. So sometimes searching by the name is a little confusing, or it's very general. So the EIN number is like their social security number. It's very easy to find them that way. This contact information generally comes from that section on the 990 form where they have who to contact about grants. So this is a great place. If you do download the CSV spreadsheet, this is the information that's going to appear in there. And then it just gives you some geographic information as well. If you wanted to download this, you can download it at the top, either as a PDF or you can email it directly from the database. All the links externally will work, but the internal database links will not work if you click them and you're not either a subscriber or at the library. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so that's a grantmaker profile. You can also search for specific funders. If you go into the advanced search and filters, there's that organization name. You can start typing an organization's name and you can see the funder's profile that way. You can also search for recipients that way as well. So if you wanted to search yourself, you can do that. So that is just a very brief overview of how you can search and find things in the database. I could spend all day talking about this really, but for the sake of time, I'm going to return to our slides unless we have any questions about using the Foundation Directory Professional. So if you do, feel free to put those into the Q&A or the chat. I do not see anything right now, so I'm going to go back to my slides. So as you go through and do your research, whether that's through the Foundation Directory Professional or another resource, as you read through the documentation that the funder provides, you want to think, do they fund in an area that is of interest to my organization that we support and the populations that we serve? The closer that match is, the stronger your application is going to be. Are they funding in my geographic region? This is a very important thing to read about, to look at the eligibility requirements, because some funders have very specific geographies that they support. So if you're applying and they don't support your geography, it's a waste of your time, it's a waste of their time. Will they provide the type of support that I need? Do they support, say I'm looking for general operating support. Do they support general operating support? Will they give me specifically general operating support? Do they support capital expenditures? Some funders do not do that. Other funders specifically fund capital expenditures. So you want to look at that. And that's where that transaction type and support strategy search terms can be helpful. And of course, you want to have that number in mind. Do they have the capacity to fund what I need? Um, of course, read through all the documentation, make sure you're not restricted from applying. You do meet the eligibility. That is very, very crucial. And then as you go through, have an idea of how much money you are going to be asking for, that you're going to be applying for, and match the capacity of what you need with the funder. Funders vary in their capacity to give. Again, they do have to give that 5% of their total assets for a private foundation at least. Some funders give more. Usually they're sticking with that 5%. But every funder has different size assets. And they may not give large grants in the area that you're looking for. So that's when you want to see, is what I'm trying to do as an organization a priority for the funder? Do they fund heavily in this area? And then how do you ask? So we saw in that Wallerstein profile that their initial approach was a letter of inquiry or a letter of interest. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, also known as an LOI. Usually the proposal is not going to be your initial approach. You're going to reach out to the grant manager or whoever is provided as a contact for grant applications to get more information. You may have to fill out an eligibility survey to see if you are actually eligible. That's usually a screening process that a lot of funders do to make sure that they're not getting these huge applications for grantees that aren't even eligible to apply. Do they have an open application process or do they only give to pre-selected grantees? Again, if they only give to pre-selected grantees, don't let that discourage you. Again, you might be able to build a relationship with the funder through networking, through showing that you are a credible nonprofit to get invited to apply. And that does take time. So give yourself time, make sure you're considering that as you're applying for grants. Finding those connections within your network, within your board, your leadership, with the funder, and then looking at their initial approach. Do they provide someone that you can reach out and call? Know why you're approaching the funder before you contact them. Do your research well before you reach out to them so that you have talking points, that you know, oh, they supported this and this is what we're doing, and that's why I'm talking to you. Because I know you have a track record of supporting this subject area or this geography. And this is what we're doing within our organization. I'm going to grab some water because I'm getting a little froggy. Sorry about that. So we're almost at the end of our presentation, but Remember, build on those connections. You don't need to know someone to get the grant, but it really does help if you're referred by a connection. That could be super helpful. Usually people are not going to refer you unless they really believe in you, and that really goes a long way with funders. So build on your network, reach out to people that are doing similar work in your organization. Use your social media, whether that's LinkedIn, whatever your social media platform is, to kind of connect. But do it strategically and make sure you're doing it with purpose. You know why you're connecting with these people. You're doing that research first. If you can, try to talk to someone, do a face-to-face conversation, use the telephone contact, but that initial contact is usually going to be brief. So know what your talking points are, know why you're contacting them, and if you do have a contact, utilize that. Don't talk about money right away. If you have a specific project that you think might interest them, you can talk about that, but you may not want to bring up that money ask right away. And so some key takeaways for today, make sure that you are grant ready, that you have that infrastructure and that time to apply, find grants, and to execute grants. Know what your budget and costs are within your organization. You may need to break those up into pieces. Um, Look for the right fit. The closer the fit between your mission as an organization, what you're trying to do, and the funder's priorities, more successful you're going to be. And again, while you're building that relationship with the funder, focus on that motivation. Show that if they support you, it's going to be a mutually beneficial relationship, that you are a credible nonprofit, you can do the work, and you can further their mission if they fund you. Remember, funders are people too. They talk to each other, they're there. Some are more reachable than others. Every funder is different. So if you know one funder, you know one funder. Um, so keep that in mind when you do apply or when you make that approach. You want to tailor it to the specific funder, and you are approaching that person and you know why. So again, we are not the only library in New Jersey or nationwide that provides on-site access to that Foundation Directory Professional and GuideStar Pro. These are some other libraries that I showed you before that have that subscription service. Again, this list changes, so I strongly encourage you, if you go into a library, you might want to give them a call ahead of time, see what they have to offer. And if they're not on this list, definitely look at your local public library. I'm always floored at the different services that libraries, not only in New Jersey, but nationwide, provide um, to nonprofits and businesses throughout the state. So definitely take advantage. That is part of your network. So explore that. My name is Lee Clark. I am the Business and U.S. Documents Librarian Specialist within our research library here at this New Jersey State Library. If you have questions, um, my email is lclark@njstatelib.org, and my number is on the screen there. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. You can give us a call. We are open to the public Monday through Friday to walk-in visitors from 10 to 4 and by appointment for research purposes from 8 to 10 a.m. Currently, we're closed today because of construction, but we're normally open to the public. So if you wanted to come in and use the services, you don't need an appointment if you're coming after 10 o'clock. You can just come in and use them. But if you did need some hands-on assistance, I do one-on-one tutorials that go into more depth than what we got into today for the Foundation Directory. So I can always schedule an appointment with you if you did want to come on site to the state library. We do have parking available in the parking garage at the library if you wanted to park, if you're driving as well. That's a common question we get. I did mention this before, but we do have an intro to proposal writing class coming up on April 1st. That is a 1-hour class. It's virtual. It's from 12 to 1. So if you're interested in learning more about just like the basics of grant proposal writing, the common questions that you might be asked, the common sections that you might see, feel free to sign up for that. And then if we have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Feel free to put those into the chat if you have any. See if we have any in the chat currently. Also, Andrew has put in the credentials for logging into the Foundation Directory Professional. So please copy those before you exit today's webinar. There's a URL where you would click, and then you're going to have the username, which is an email. That's going to go into the username, and your password is case sensitive. So make sure you get that. If you have any questions about that, feel free to email Andrew or myself. So we do have a question. If a funder doesn't want to give you the full amount that you ask for, will they fund a smaller amount? Or do they give you what you ask for or nothing? If I ask for 5,000, will they possibly say, sorry, not 5,000, but here's 1,000? Yeah, that could definitely be a possibility. It depends on the funder, it depends on the capacity to give. Sometimes funders get so many applications that they only have a certain pot of money to spend. And you've submitted a very good application. You are a good fit, but for some reason, there were better applicants. Doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't qualify if had been more money. Sometimes funders will come back and ask you about your budget expenses. Sometimes they will say, okay, you've asked for this, but we're only going to fund this money. That does happen. It depends on the funder. I talk about this in our introduction to proposal writing class, but if you can get feedback from the funder based on, say you got a no for your application, oftentimes you can go back to the funder and get feedback and say, like, ask them, would it be appropriate for me to apply later on? Is there any recommendations that you have to make our application better? Usually there's a rubric that is used to score your grant application. Sometimes you can get that, or you can get some notes from the reviewers. Every funder, of course, is different. But yes, that situation where a funder might come back and say, um, we can fund this amount does happen. Okay, I don't see any more questions, but if you do have any, please feel free to put those in the chat. Andrew, did I miss any questions?
No.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to pass it back over to you, Andrew, if you have any final comments.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lee. We really, really appreciate it. As Lee mentioned, those credentials are available for about 48 hours, so please take them down and use them. If you do have any further questions, you want a tutorial, anything, please contact Lee. She is very available and fantastic at what she does, so I encourage you to utilize this resource in your searching and all the work that you're doing for your organization. So I don't see any other questions, so I think we can go ahead and end it there. So thank you, Lee, and thank you everybody for attending. Everybody be safe, be well, and hopefully we'll see you soon.